So thank you all for joining us. Thank you for your messages of support and all of your help and friendship over the last few months. We're getting slowly back to normal, and I hope in the coming months steadily back to normal. Tonight we've got a wonderful event of poetry, poems being read by the people who wrote them, and poets, I think, always read their poetry the best, and so I'm very much looking forward to it. The evening is going to be hosted by Bernard O'Donoghue and Jane Griffiths. Bernard was a tutorial fellow in English here at Wadham for many years, and is now a much loved emeritus fellow of the college, and of course a wonderful poet, And so it was particularly fitting that his successor in that post-tutorial fellowship in English was Jane Griffiths. So we now have established a tradition at Wadham that at least one of our tutorial fellows in English will be a poet, and that's a very good tradition. And Jane is also a wonderful poet, and I've heard her read her poetry many, many times, including very shortly after I first arrived. I remember in the Wadham room of the King's Arms when you were reading poetry for the Oxford Poetry Society. So again, I'm really looking forward to listening to you tonight. So can I hand over now to Jane and Bernard, who are going to host this event this evening.
Thanks very much, Ken, and a very warm welcome to everyone. I'm just going to give you a very quick outline of the running order this evening. First of all, Bernard will introduce our first two readers, who will be Michael Schmidt and Rowan Williams. And when they've read for a while, I will introduce our next two readers, Hilary Davies and Grevel Lindop. And after they've read, we'll take questions for all the speakers just at the end of the event. And if you would like to ask a question, it would be great if you could put it in the chat function. So I hope you enjoy the readings, and I will now hand over to Bernard to introduce the first poets.
Thanks, Jane, and thanks, Ken. I'm introducing Michael Schmidt and Rowan Williams. Michael will read first, so I'll talk about him first. He's a very important poet publisher. He's the founder and director of Carcanet Press, which is probably the most adventurous poetry publisher in the country, well, one of the leading poetry publishers in the world. Carcanet, there are 68 pages of Carcanet poets in Wikipedia, for example. Michael describes himself as an Anglophone Mexican publisher. He was born in Mexico City. He was at Wadham 1967 to 71. But while he was an undergraduate, he founded the Carcanet Press, which was a very extraordinary thing to do, to immediate success, really. And it really has gone from strength to strength. There's a great tradition, of course, of poet publishers in England. The name Eliot comes to mind, for example. But Michael calling himself just a publisher is very much only a part of the of his definition. I remember his first books and being very taken by their political content, their openness to the world at large. He's also a wonderful personal poet, as you will hear when he reads. Now, after Michael, Rowan Williams will read. I can't avoid the inevitable standard joke about introducing people who need no introduction. Ex-Archbishops of Canterbury are not that common, even amongst poets. But Rowan described himself as a poet to whom religious things mattered intensely. He's had a very distinguished, of course, career in the church and in Oxford and Cambridge. He was a lecturer in divinity in Oxford. He did a DPhil at Wadham in 1975 with A.M. Alching. He's a great supporter of liberal and creative causes of all kinds. And he, having been Archbishop of Canterbury and held other bishoprics too. He has now gone back to being a parish priest in Abergavenny in Wales. So first of all, Michael Schmidt and then Rowan.
Thank you very much indeed, Bernard. I was at Wadham, as you said, in 67 to 71, and my master was, for the most of the time, was Sir Maurice Bowra. I remember he was moving out of his lodgings, and he threw open the window of his lodgings and said, "Do you like Conrad, Schmidt?" And I said, "Rather." And he gave me all of his Conrad first editions, and he gave me a wonderful Edith Sitwell inscribed himself. He was a wonderful master, and also we had as our English don until the arrival of Terry Eagleton, which was, I think, the end of my studies in English, a man called Ian Donaldson, who was a superb professor. And I thought I'd begin by reading two poems that I composed when I was at Wadham as an undergraduate. I also had the advantage at Wadham of having Grevel Lindop as a friend, and he was quite instrumental in the founding of Carcanet. And I'm pleased to say that tonight we have three Carcanet poets reading. Hilary is the only one who isn't yet a Carcanet poet. Rowan is one of my favorite poets on the list as well. And I wonder if one day you'll invite one of the most neglected and funny poets writing today, who's also an old Wadhamite, and that is Miles Burrows, a really wonderful poet who studied Russian, I think, when he was at Wadham, and then became a physician and has worked all over the world, and has amused my later years considerably. The first little poem is called A Phrase of Dryden's Virgil. I loved Dryden, but I particularly loved his translation of Virgil, which I don't think is a particularly popular stance to take these days. "All was the nights," he wrote, "all was the nights. I cannot add a word. I go along a gravel path between shrubs sick with rose scent, and on the pool a shimmering bow of starlight marks the easy entrance to the dark." The second poem I'd like to read is a poem called The English Lesson After Pasternack. There was a little book of Pasternack's that I got in Mexico, which I loved and read to tatters. And this was one of the poems in that book, not terribly well translated, but I did love the poems of Pasternack. I then read many other translations, in particular Donald Davies, of this particular poem. When it was Desdemona's turn to sing, and only minutes of her life remained, she did not mourn her star that she had loved. She sang about a tree, a willow tree. When it was Desdemona's time to sing, her voice grew deeper, darker as she sang. The darkest, coldest demon kept for her a weeping song of streams through rough beds flowing. And when it was Ophelia's turn to sing, and only minutes of her life remained, she was dry as light, as a twig of hay. Wind blew her from the loft into the storm. And when it was Ophelia's time to sing, her dreams were waning, all but the dream of death. Bitter and tired, what tokens sank with her, in her hair wild celandine and willows in her arms. Then, letting fall the rags of human passion, heart first they plunged into the flowing dark, fracturing their bodies like white tinder, silencing their unbroken selves with stars. I wrote a lot of poems when I was at Oxford, and not many of them survive in my affection. Shortly after leaving Oxford to come to Manchester, I started writing a series of short-line poems, which I'm still very fond of. Some of them were on biblical themes and some of them weren't. So the first one I shall read of the two is Sisera. It's about Sisera. It somehow sort of envisages that Sisera had a kind of relationship with Jael, but not too complex. I was simply asleep. There was a sound in my ear. A form moved in my tent, a hammer and a spike. The spike pricked my brow and then the hammer fell. I feel the years. Impaled, I lie within my tent. My army dies, the flies have come and gone away. I know who she was. She may return. I lie still and do not speak or cry. I let her do her will. My name is Sisera. I will not say her name. She may still be alive. This other short line poem remains one of my favorites. I'm not quite sure why. It was described somewhere as a bisexual poem, which rather startled me, but we'll see what you think. It's called Choice. And it is, I think, true that when you cut a worm in two, both halves of the worm survive. Choice. I am like the worm, cut in two, I'd thrive. Within the metaphor I greet myself, I take my right hand in my right, and looking eye to eye, I'm satisfied. I need a knife to make it true, a simple slice and clean, another lover too. The worm resembles me. The rough dark hardens it. Within the metaphor it only knows it is, and not which way it goes, to what, from what, how far. I want a blade to fall between me, so I move forward, fore and aft, and double the odds for love. The worm and I emerge into the rainy light. We wander on the lawn and lose our entrances. I kneel on a flagstone and press it with my thumb. It twists into a ring and writhes away again. Here, resemblance ends, like casual marriages. And this next poem is a much later poem. I don't move quite up to the present because the present poems haven't really settled into my memory, but this is a poem from about 40 years ago, 35 years ago. If only he hadn't, it's called Third Persons. If only he hadn't answered the door when she knocked, the phone when she called. If when he started to write his most brilliant story, he'd expunged her arrival, choosing instead to introduce an easier lover, or in place of marriage, travel. It's chilling to witness her coming, her hand on the knocker. He was older maybe, settled. She came with tears and charm and magic perhaps, I don't recall. Startled into a posture of love and grateful, she was after all young, beautiful. He embraced her and for a decade more let himself believe he loved her even after her eyes turned and her head in so many obvious directions, and her laughter spread like pink blossom over numerous other lawns, spread deeper and softer. And blithely she gave herself up to many temptations of love. He could not finish it. He could not close the poisoned chapter. He could not breathe. He gave her the benefit of every single doubt, resisting. Yet at last, he threw the story out. On a more cheerful subject now, this is about a scriptorium and a scribe. It's called Pangur Ban. You probably know the story. It's Irish. I will mispronounce the Irish names. I apologize to my Irish hosts. So it's about comparing this Irish scribe to St. Jerome. Jerome has his enormous dozy lion. Myself, I have a cat, my Pangur Ban. What did Jerome feed up his lion with? Always he's fat and fleecy, always sleeping as if after a meal. Perhaps a Christian, perhaps a lamb or a fish or a loaf of bread. His lion's always smiling, chin on paw, what looks like purring, rippling his face. And there on Jerome's escritoire by the quill and ink pot, the long black thorn he drew from the lion's paw. Look, Pangur, at the picture of the lion, not a mouser like you, not lean, not ever chasing a quill as it flutters over parchment, leaving its trail that is the word of God. Pangur, you are so trim beside the lion. Unlike Jerome, in the mouth of his desert cave, wrapped in a wardrobe of robes despite the heat, I, in this Irish winter, Pangur Ban, am cold, without so much as your pillowcase of fur, white with ginger tips on ears and tail. My name is neither here nor there. I am employed by Columcille, who will be a saint because of me and how I have set down the word of God. He pays, he goes to heaven. I stay on earth in this cell with a high empty window, the long light in summer, the winter stars. I work with my quill and colors, bent and blinder each season, colder, but the pages fill. Just when I started work, the cat arrived, sleek and sharp at my elbow out of nowhere. I dipped my pen. He settled in with me. He listened and replied. He kept my counsel. Here in the margin, Pangur, I inscribe you. Almost amen. Prowl out of now and go down into time's garden, wary with your tiptoe hearing. You'll live well enough on mice and shrews till you find the next scriptorium, a bowl of milk. Some scribe will recognize you, Pangur Ban, and feed you. You'll find your way to him as you did to me, from nowhere, but you sniffed out your Jerome. Stay by him too, until his gospel's done. I linger over John, the closing verses. You're restless, won't be touched. I'm old, the solstice. Amen, dear Pangroban, amen. Be sly. And as a last poem, I'll just read a poem which is dedicated because it quotes a wonderful line from an American poet, British born, but an American emigrant, as it were, Edward Taylor, who used to write a poem each time he celebrated the sacrament. And there's a huge volume of his poems, a few of which are astonishing in their surprises, and one or two of which are extraordinarily beautiful. You'll probably recognize his line because it comes twice, once at the end of the second 5-line stanza and once at the end of the poem itself. And the poem is based on a little chapel in Oaxaca state, which is full of images of the martyrs. And it gave a wonderful sense to the communion of saints. And it's a poem about communion, of course. An Easter Carol for Edward Taylor. Long fields of yellow wheat in Palestinian sun are ripening into flesh. The vineyards on the hill bring forth a salty fruit. There where the bread was torn off of the human loaf, where years began to count because a child was born, I come to eat my word. Before me at the rail is Stephen with the stones turned into loaves by love, and James of Zebedee carries his singing head. Peter and Philip bear splinters of their cross trees, Bartholomew his skin rolled up beneath his arm, Thomas from India with his appalling spear, and sweet Sebastian too, God's willing porcupine, and Agatha whose heart is caroling with hurt, Perpetua with her own new baby clutched at her breast, Felicity her slave whose child will not be born, attended by the beasts that tore them limb from limb, and slouch now tame and meek to Bethlehem and kneel the way the sheep and ox knelt on that first day. Cyprian and Polycarp both try to sneak away, but drawn by the infant host, out dazzling from the crib, the flare of martyrs' fires, Antipas on the grill, Domitian's brazen bull, and all the melting saints that lit his jubilees, and later La Pucelle, and in a northern town, Cranmer and Ridley too, transcendent kindling, making the tongues of flame speak so we understood. They climbed their Calvary, carrying such precious gifts as Africa can spare. There where the wine was spilled out of the Virgin's womb, belief and disbelief, faithful and faithless kneel, because whatever's true, a child is going to grow on whom we can impress fear, hatred, and desire. A child we will impale and plant in every grave. We do it by the book. I come to eat my word. Thank you very much, Wadham, for inviting me back.
Thank you for coming. That was wonderful, Michael. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone. And may I echo the thanks that Michael has expressed to Wadham. It's a great delight to be with this very distinguished company of fellow poets, and a great delight to be involved in Wadham once again. I arrived at Wadham just after Michael had left, so we didn't meet at that point, but we've had the pleasure of knowing each other since. But I'm not going to follow Michael's example and start with poems I wrote during those years, mostly because the very few poems I wrote at that time are pretty awful. So I'm going to read some rather more recent ones, and particularly those not yet published. I want to frame the poems I'm reading in a way that reflects something of the last 12 months or so. So I'm going to begin with a poem that was written for Easter Sunday 2020, and later on a poem that I've just completed in recent weeks, as it were, looking at the arc of the last year. So first of all, Easter Sunday 2020. It's in 3 parts. The first is called The Doors Being Shut. The moon's soft gong has sounded somewhere, dawn air padding at it, and the dense flurry rises, prickles and liquid chit and purr, and the breath of soil grass blossoms, the dressing gown, drapery not yet burned off by hard-working heat. Walk into it, the cloud discovered only in this cold space, walking a tall man's length from the next riser from sleep. This is the cloud in which stones grind fast, spark, and the first fire jumps out above the sun. Noli me tangere. I could have said, don't touch me. Never mind the doctrine mandating your distance. Why should you have the right to probe and roam wincing skin, browsing to find the little doorways into familiar pains? I don't want what I know. I don't want thick air, the breathless, damp neighborhood of voices and beating words, the clouds swaddling and rubbing with old practiced polishing sweeps of a working thumb. A tall man's length from me. Do you know how I want that? And the third section, heartburn. Standing here, weather moves through us. Drifts like microbes or like neutrons falling, clouds of prickling song or picking nails. A tall man's length away, unmoving, is the visitor. Whether in touch or not, I can't decide. The moon, rinsed to a shred, dissolves. Clouds are sucked upwards, light turns raw, earth dries out. So what am I hungry for? The globe of shining distance, for the palm of breath and liquid sound against the face, for the thin, thin, unseeable gap between breath and breath, opening and clenching, where it burns so hard, so quick, you don't know hot from cold, or now from then, or I and it, the needle point where the gong starts to blossom, and the air quivers with wounds and difference. That's a poem in some ways about bodies, the proximity and the danger and the difficulty of bodies in contact. And I want now to read you two poems which were prompted by some artworks of Anthony Gormley's, an artist for whom I've got enormous affection and respect. And the two that I've chosen are, first of all, a work called Transport, which hangs in Canterbury Cathedral in the crypt. And it's made out of it's made out of nails from the old roof of the cathedral, arranged in the form of a body. So this is for Anthony Gormley, Transport. As on the last day, a stone slides sideways, and the long shape floats, blind, virginal arms tucked at the sides, into the hollow arc gathering the pillars. Then, as on every day, halts and hangs. And from here up, the words haze around it, wisps of smoke, streaming, nudging at it, tiny snouted things pushing at a log athwart the river. Speak, and a half hour afterwards, perhaps you notice it, shifted a foot or so, aslant between grave and sky, moved but not yet flown home by all the murmur from the tourists and the altars, from the questions and answers looking for each other in twists and cross-flows, never visible from the floor. We can't see whether one ever sparks another, flows in one fast draining vortex into dark and motionless homecoming, nudged at last into the stream. What holds the long shape once held up the vault? Not flesh, not bone, but nails, as if this body of our aborted resurrection once had been a great felt mannequin for pinning messages and curling snaps and numbers and reminders, and they fell one by one onto the sinking floor, and the furred nap peeled away in some unseen storm, and the metal pins and bolts and tacks clung on together, magnetized. The shape that rises is the shape of all those sharp points driving through numbers and postcards, a smeared, indecipherable stab into a lost soft tissue, all the body that will rise, made up afresh, from the clinging metals that opened casual wounds. Keep talking, and the clustered nails keep turning. Breathe. The body shifts in the river's leisurely flow. No drift of wind blows off scale from the armature. The only open eyes and draughty gaps between lost messages, lost numbers and reminders, turned in the creeping breeze from the floor we look from, watching the dangerous body hang where lightning's known to strike, holding our breath in case it leaks and makes the spark, the river, leap. The second poem for Anthony Gormley is based on his work Subject, which was in an exhibition in Kettle's Yard in Cambridge in 2018. And this is another human body fixed at a rather strange angle to the wall. There is before, surely, and behind and underneath, feet planted, and the skull's neat dome locking me in between walls. Here, though, from one walled room to the next, from floor to ceiling, long rods shine and travel, and the map moves silently around, down, up. The angles yawn or snap, my skull a bowl to dive in, twisting and curled from a wet boarded ceiling, or my feet fixed to a wall, so that, undomed, unlocked, what is on top is open mouth, hollow, shaved face. Whether behind me is 6 inches or thousands of empty fathoms doesn't signify. Anchored somewhere, all I can do is lie on absence, pushing my shoulder blades down on the air's breathy bed to dent it into shape, into a holy shroud. Now, thinking about bodies involves also thinking about places, spaces that bodies occupy. And a few years ago, I had the very agreeable experience of spending a night in Cypress Well, Charles Causley's former home in Lunston in Cornwall. And when writers are invited to spend a night or sometimes a weekend in Cypress Well, they're encouraged to write something in the visitor's book. So I did what I was told to do. I wrote something in the visitor's book, and this is it. It's called Cypress Well, in memory of Charles Causley, a poet I dearly love. Sometimes it's a clock ticking that punctuates the stream of whatever it is that flows through a silent house. Sometimes, look across the room, a fingered dance tapping the white open spaces with typewriter's stiletto heels. Sometimes, from a line in a far valley, the anapaestic hooves conjured by locomotives, breaking the smooth iron track into staves and clacking feet. This is the beat here, echo of a steady voyage, fingers tracking the pace of life watched through these washed panes, eyebrows raised, fingers probing for the pulse driving flesh and soul, the thump of brief feet over the skipping rope out in the schoolyard, where they learn to keep time to their grandmother's verses. Now, then, and now, a hand moves up to pull the cord. Communication, as the carriages shock, jostle, and fall still, silent, like the house. One of Michael's poems that we heard was about saints and martyrs, and one of the names mentioned there was Thomas Cranmer. Here's a poem about Cranmer, which is really also about bodies and what is written on them, in them, however you want to put it. That's called Thomas Cranmer. Recycling parchment was a skill you needed when the business of bookmaking was expensive, glacially slow. Taking the pumice stone to rub the surface, shave it smooth of the whispering filaments, the bristles pushing through. Scrape down to silence. Hold it before the firelight, to check its new nakedness. After they dressed him up in coloured rags and pointed hat, they stripped him to his shift again and scraped the hair off from his skull and took a knife to shave the hands of the last lingering stubborn damp of holy oil. Dry and stubbled, he hung there, a skin to write on, naked, old and fresh. I never knew words could be so grand and swept. What shall I cry? After the stone's rub and the knife, now I am held up to the fire. He runs into the rain, slipping on treacherous cobbles, praying the drizzle would streak the skin again in black. He puts his hand out, peering in firelight, to sign a last will or a New Testament. I was asked some years ago to write a short piece for a Welsh composer for the centenary of the great disastrous Battle of Mametz Wood, 1916, when several thousand Welsh soldiers were slaughtered within about 6 hours. It's the conflict which haunts David Jones's great, in parenthesis, Owen Shears has also written about it more recently. So here's a poem called Mametz. It incorporates a few quotes from letters from people who witnessed the aftermath of the conflict. The twigs catch in the itchy cloth, pins plucking insistently, young hands that pick, cling, branches whispering, don't go, must you, come back soon, I'll miss you. Thorns like voices, voices like thorns. Flesh catches on the wood. I saw one tree hold in its branches a leg. Heads caught by the hair. Red against green. Leaves, the dark, running, hot snapping shards, plucking insistently, pinching a life out here, a life there. A jaw, an eye, and half a stomach, the black wood pecking, small claws, whispering, don't go, not ever. Whispering under the white and deafening blanket, stay here, I'll miss you, with each dip of the black head. They hang in the trees, not a tree unbroken. Long coloured capitals, foliated, streaming, name after name after name after name, cut in the wood's torn page, cutting the itchy fabric of statistics. Writing. Red. Couple more, if I may. Before the recent poem, marking, as it were, the first anniversary of the lockdown, I'd just like to intrude a poem about poetry, because it's one of the things that we tend to write about. We write about the process, and this is a little intermission, as it were, but written after a poetry event in North Wales near Aberdaron, a part of an R.S. Thomas related event. The Roundhouse at Velinichaf near Aberdaron is a remarkable place, and an evening of poetry there prompted this poem, Velinichaf, Poetry in the Roundhouse. The wall leaves a gap, a grinning letterbox before the thatch starts. Steady light pours smooth into the long mould, sets in a beam, pivoting on the sill, tilting by inches slowly as the thirsty darkness on the far side of the wooded rise hauls it down and pulls the bucket up out of the wide fire's well. It hauls the smoke into the glowing mould, packing it firm. Sparks, scraps of ash blazing like snowflakes, the smoke's column a blizzard of sharp stars. The writers round the fire feel their way by inches, hauled to their feet by the rising dark, their words spat fast out of the whirl of charred debris. Poems blaze in the glowing bar of smoke and disappear, grey in the roof. And they sit again, the poets, sink into the cooling cauldron. Hard to believe that what they mixed, kneaded, moulded, boiled, is so quickly eaten in the shadows. A short shining in the bright moulded smoke, then the grey drift into evening. The poets wonder, shrinking again to their benches, how is it anyone believes where it all started, before the long patibulum lifted them up and out. And so to the most recent poem, which was simply called Post-Vax, and it's set in the evocative environment of the Splot Community Centre in Cardiff, where I received both my vaccinations in the last few months. Converted community centre and sports hall. Face the wall, 15 minutes sitting. Are we there yet? Muffled routines wrapped round numbers and dates of birth and reassurances. Fatigue. Polite and weaponless, fatigue-clad welcomers steering. All afloat in the pungent stream of gel, dense and meandering seaward, as we stare facing the wall. Novices in the zendo, bristling for the tread of masters with sticks. Or teams braced along the floor's hieroglyphs to leap and land the ball. Breathe out. Are we there yet? Feather-light fresh infections drift without landing, weaponless, through the air's crisp rustling, where numbers and dates and reassurances float, while the wall looks back at us, a patient goal, waiting for touch, waiting for what arrives. And in the drift and rustle, something has shifted, roots loosening in the belly till we can almost hear it, the body's tight pouch silently punctured. Thank you very much indeed.
I'd like to say a very warm thank you to our two readers so far, Michael and Rowan. And I would like also to introduce our next two readers. The first of these is Hilary Davies. She is a poet, translator and critic who's published 4 collections of poetry with Enith Arman, most recently Exile and the Kingdom in 2016. She was one of the first intake of women undergraduates at Wadham, where she read French and German. And she went on to be head of languages at St Paul's Girls' School for 19 years. She's also been a tutor in creative writing, a lecturer in English linguistics and a TEFL teacher, as well as an RLF fellow at the British Library. I was listening to some of her podcasts the other day and was delighted to find a reflection on how writing changes the writer. And Hilary says, totally. Writing is a compulsion that changes the way you behave and makes you antisocial. It doesn't just change the way you see the world, but changes the world you see. Poetic practice depends on years of training below the level of consciousness. And I thought this was a wonderful way of describing the way that writing and the writing of poetry gets into the life. This evening, in a moment, she'll be reading, among other things, from some new work, which will eventually go into a new collection. Our final reading this evening will come from Grevel Lindop. He read English at Wadham, where he co-edited Carcanet with fellow undergraduate Michael Schmidt. It was Carcanet that published Grevel's first booklet, Against the Sea, in 1969, and subsequently he's published 6 further books, all with Carcanet, most recently Luna Park in 2015. Grevel went from Wadham and from Wolfson indeed to Manchester, where he became Professor of Romantic and Early Victorian Studies and, among other things, edited the collected works of Thomas de Quincey. Even after becoming a freelance writer in 2001, he continued to work as a scholar and critic, as well as a poet, publishing the definitive biography of Charles Williams in 2015, and editing the selected poems of Thomas Chatterton, which came out from Routledge last year. His work on Williams, who of course was one of the Oxford group known as the Inklings and a writer of novels that could be described as spiritual thrillers, reflects his belief in the importance of what he calls the deep imagination, the place where our individual insight and creativity connect with universal archetypes and spiritual dimensions. Grevel is also the only person I've ever met who can recite large parts of John Skelton's poem Speak Parrot by heart. So let's turn to these readings. I see someone's got their hand up, but if it's a question, could we please put questions in the chat and we'll take them after all the readers have read. That would be lovely. Hilary, over to you. Hilary, you're muted.
Yes, thank you. Yes, that's what we want. Thank you very much, and thank you very much to everybody who's come tonight from all over the globe. It's very good of you because there will be many different times of the day, I'm sure, for you. I'm going to begin at the beginning with my mother and father, who were the first to open my mind to the world of language and the imagination. This poem is called Beachy Head. For those of you not familiar with the British coast, it's a spectacular white chalk cliff that looks out over the English Channel towards France. Beachy Head. I see you now, my mother and father, coming up this cliff slowly, though you did so but yesterday, as if you are long dead. Here my father, placing his legs askew as he pulls for breath, turns to look back down the twisting path they have come. My mother touches her arthritic knee, and all around the great arc of the world encloses them. Oh, keep back from the dazzling edge, Daddy, don't move with your vertigo closer to the drop, the terrible slippage. Lay out your provisions and go giddy with the clouds running overhead. And my mother unwraps the boiled eggs, lets tea from the thermos, lies down close to the ticking grass, while across to France the years flash back and forth with their insistent whisper, hish, hish, lullaby. Wash away our hurt down the shingle. How these two rheumatic-y people shimmer like gods in the grass. The White Cliffs, this time of Dover, figure again briefly in the next poem, which is taken from a sequence called Across Country, about pilgrimage through life. Now that the world is that of exploration, the immensity of experience to be had when you're young, of falling in love for the first time, both with another country, in this case France, and with a person. The départemental, which I mentioned, is a French classification for a minor road that tends to cross country. In Britain, something like a B road. Oh, to be young in the white cliffs of Dover, new as a chrisma to the bright March blue and the boat's wake gashing its path through the rolled back sea. As the juggernauts tumbled off the car decks, I took up the map and began to navigate. Let me praise now the départemental, how it turns from the traffic and the scream into the long, slow loop of highway, this fugue of difference, this rosary of place, strung with the glory of cornfield and bell tower, granite, limestone, vineyard and cloister, on and on in the swoop of creation, and the evening come under the doved turret wall. Sundown in the bars and hostelries, eyes glitter. A little river trails its shimmer past the bread and wine. Slender as aspen, slow as peacocks, the lovers enter upon their matchless stage to step that antique dance for the first time. Each, the unique, the unsurpassable sweetness lifts into grace, to the dappled courtyard, to nightfall by the weeping willow, to life's covenant in the first kiss. Nearly all my adult life, I've lived in cosmopolitan areas of large cities, Paris and London mostly. Where I now live in northeast London, there are apparently more languages spoken than in any other constituency in Britain. And I hoped to capture that diversity in the following poem. Abney Park, which it's named after, is a 19th century cemetery at the centre of all this urban life, a nature haven now popular with local people. And amongst the trees, you constantly glimpse the evocative funerary monuments of the Victorian era, which include many weeping angels. In Abney Park, the angels are praying in Abney Park. Up and down Church Street hammers the city, buses and lorries, the motorbikes scream, fire engines, sirens, car radios, convertibles, strutting and wailing their terrors and dreams. The angels are praying in Abney Park. Here in the city, trade is empire. Sweet fruits in the market, the broad Costa cries, jerky chicken, linguine, halva, cinnamon, kosher. The blood of the 5 seas salts our lullabies. The angels are praying in Abney Park. Mark our fortunes. Past me the stream of the living, the coming, laughs, stops, flows. I am mayfly, thistle fleck, among the nations, sifting and surging on the old high road. The angels are praying in Abney Park. Here we lie, under the green and the urban nettle, where a brook flew by, and the sun and snow have settled. Season by season, we listen to the world's great cry. The angels are praying in Abney Park. Where I live is also in the Lee Valley, which is the largest tributary of the Thames and an important wetland area for wildfowl and aquatic life. My late husband, the poet Sebastian Barker, and I often walked along the towpath here. There's one mentioned, Bomb Crater Pond, which is exactly what the name says it is, a pond made when a stray German bomb fell in the marshes during the Second World War. Walk here with me. We do not know how long. The braided waters cross the marsh beside Bomb Crater Pond. Bulrushes sing by the causeway in the leafing copses, and through the air we hear the tumble of the swallows, their high cloud mewing. The sun was all around us. Oh, my darling, how in the harvest of our days we were, and on the swans' backs the pearls of life streamed. Now the water of your breath breaks in a rainbow over each moment we walked together, where the willows and alders stretch their arms heavenward, and the cormorants circle over the rowers, oh, so full of life, beating into the future. But here, see, my heart is hung on the hawthorn. For you, with your stoop stride, never, never, never will walk by my side along the sweetly river, nor lift your head to hear the geese cry keening ever again. And I'm going to read just two more poems. I read French and German at Wadham, and one part of my professional life was spent teaching these two languages. And over the years, the Rhineland has become a second home to me. This poem that follows is from a sequence called Reinfugue in my last collection, in which I speak of the river's importance over many centuries as a barrier and a frontier, as a source of wealth, a meeting place and a stream of exchange, one of the great foci of Europe. And this particular poem evokes the historic moment when Marshal Blucher's Prussian and Russian forces, on their way ultimately to Waterloo, crossed the river at dead of night in a magnificently planned stealth operation to catch the French, who were then occupying the west bank of the Rhine unawares. But it's also about how ordinary people get caught up in the horrors of war. There are two place names, the villages of Perscheid and Steg. And the Tartar horsemen brought by the Russian forces had a very different riding style from that of the Prussians, or indeed the Rhinelanders, and you will hear that. New Year's Day, 1814, Blucher crosses the Rhine. We had it from Daynet's daughter, Jutta, the one who married over the river, a man from Perscheid, God help her. They were moving oxen in the farmyard when the toddler slipped and cracked her head on the ice. So she had her in her arms and was comforting her with a stick of sugar. Suddenly the mist lifted. The sky was blue as a plover's egg. Look up there at the moon ghost, she said to the child. In that moment, she heard it, like 1,000 altar bells, which she thought very odd, since Christmas was over and she was not in church. What's that noise coming up from Steg? She asked her husband, and saw within the pale of his eye, as he gazed over her shoulder, row on row of black coats bobbing, a blur of red and gold and silver, caught the tang of horses and the musk of men. Couldn't understand a word of their shouting, even the German was difficult. And the strangest thing, how the riders of the little ponies, trotting indifferently amongst the march and clatter, sat hunched right up over their withers, half men, half beast. Hour upon hour the mass moved. She went in, saw to the geese, who were peevish and fevered by all the upset, scrubbed pans, butter churns, cut bread, fed the baby, checked the little one for bruises, swept up in the kitchen. And still, when the light went down and she was wiping her hands by the window, still the armies came, as if they would come forever, until she and the oxen and the tree, printing its sundown shadow on the chapel wall, lean their crosses in the lee of an east wind, until stakes and lances and defences are dust wisp sifting over the brow of the hill. And the last poem that I'm going to finish with is called, appropriately, Vespers, from a sequence which uses the structure of the monastic liturgical hours to talk about our relationship to faith, suffering, death, and hope. The church mentioned is that of Saul, which is a very fine and large parish church, that stands virtually alone in the flat rural countryside of Norfolk. Vespers. Hosanna's the hardest, not the easiest thing. It makes the sweat to drop in an old man's beard. So much does he know of darkness and death's road. Benediction is that act of cleansing which stops us going as our own jailers down into the dungeons that we built. Sing, sing with cymbals and in the sanctuaries. Send the heart out onto the high combs and round the evening tables to uncover what it should honor. For the heart is hungry to garner illumination into the barns of praise. What is a midge in the eye of the Lord? All that is bought, owed, earned, inherited. The grabs and saws of growth, the stridor of the corporalities, and soaring palaces stretching their fingers to the edge of doom. None hang from heaven, none display God walking in his universe as I saw today. The guests are gathered in the church at Saul. The light falls on the floor. The choir sings out the Magnificat. The bride stands at the door. The bride stands at the door and waits. Her handmaids dress her hair. The bride stands at the door and waits. Her father brings her here. And then across the fields a wind comes and catches the rose. Her veil flies up like flame. Above her head a fiery tongue it throws. The guests are gathered in the church at Saul. The light falls on the floor. For all eternity, the rose stands at heaven's door. Thank you very much, everyone.
Lovely poems, Hilary, and a great honour to be reading for Wadham, where I went to read English on my 18th birthday, and Wadham changed my life. So very nice to be back here again, if only virtually. Thank you. Michael mentioned our friendship during our undergraduate times. By no particular plan, this is a poem about Mexico, about the Cathedral of Our Lady of Guadalupe on the outskirts of Mexico City, which I'm sure Michael knows very well. For Our Lady of Guadalupe. The taxi windscreen's broken, lightning starred with a crack from one corner, signature of a stone from the Oaxaca road. It drops me by the shanty town of stalls, where I will buy her plastic image later. Garish, I hope, and cheap, for kitsch is authenticity. A jagged rift of space splits the old basilica's perfect baroque. An intricately cracked stone egg atilt on sliding subsoil where the Aztec city's lake was carelessly filled in. Crowds pass its listing shell without a glance, heading for the concrete and stained glass swirl that mimics Juan Diego's cloak, where she appeared and painted her own image on the fabric to show skeptical bishops how perfect love could visit a poor Indian after the wars and fill his cloak with roses. Now the cloak's under glass, behind the altar. A priest celebrates Mass. but we walk round the side to queue for the moving pavement that will take us closer, its mechanical glide into the dark, floating us past the sacred cloth, and her miraculous, soft, downcast gaze, not Spanish and not Indian, but both, lovely mestiza virgin, reconciler who stands against the flash bulb's irregular pizzicato of exploding stars, and while we slide on interlocking steel, opens for us her mantle, from which roses pour and pour in torrents like blood from a wound which may never be healed. One of the pleasures of reading English in the 1960s at Wadham was being taught by Alan Ward, who was our Old English tutor, a thoroughly lovable man. I think it was W.H. Auden who said that Old English, or Anglo-Saxon as it was then known, was the most valuable part of the English course for a poet, or maybe he said it was the only valuable part of the English course, I'm not sure, but he highlighted it anyway. This is a poem that derives from the Battle of Malden. In an Old English battle, you sent your hawk off and you let your horse loose before you went to fight, and you called them back afterwards if you survived. In the Battle of Malden, we're told how the English nobleman sends his hawk off. He let him that off handen, leef ne fleeran, hafok with thas halters, and to thar hilde stop. He let go then from his hand the beloved hawk, and he strode to the battle. This poem, The Malden Hawk, is the hawk's eye view. The hawk speaks. And so, dismissed, I rose on a wing beat over horses already scattering to the wood, unwanted as men turned to their war. Vassal set loose from his master's service. Blameless outlaw, freed to the houseless wild, circling I watched thickets of metal and leather crowd the shallows of the deepening tide. Now, as I scour the air, my heart divides between longing for a man's call and the wideness of the world, where I got honour by my end game, pleasing nobles in the hour when the bright dove fled the man-flung hawk. I pivot at flight's apex, but will not return, though my jewelled eye sees each ring on his corselet catch sun as he merges into the mass. Death besotted warriors on their way to darkness. Gladly I would stoop a last time into his language, but already battle's whirlpool sucks him in, his face downward, nameless and eyeless among the iron helmets. I am a word forgotten from his story. He is a landmark fading from my sight. Men had seemed to have some special knowledge. Now the sea wind tastes of death, they rush towards it. Whether to sing with saints, or feast with battle fellows, or lie at a tree's root until the world ends, they know no better than I. Never again, child of the waste moor and the tufted woodland, will I perch on that wrist, grasp the bone beneath. This is a poem which goes into what one might call Old England in a different sense. The day after the Brexit referendum, I was in a pub in Nottingham, which has a claim to be one of the oldest pubs in England. It's called, spelled with a Y, of course, instead of a thorn, Ye Old Trip to Jerusalem. And it's a pub that is carved into the castle mound at the centre of Nottingham. And I had this curious feeling that day of being somehow burrowed into the centre of England, for better and for worse. Ye Olde Trip to Jerusalem. It's like being inside an ear or a hive. Wax-coloured tunnels wind away into the rock. This room's a bowl scooped from porous stone, but for that oddly physiological crevice going up to a cobwebbed height lost in darkness above us, centuries of iron-hooped hogsheads have inscribed those perfect circles deep in the walls. The castle's overhead, once the ducal palace, smashed apart and set on fire in 1831 by a mob demanding reform. Now it's art gallery, regimental museum, beer festival. Down here, it's all so familiar. The dusty black wrought iron trim fiddling along the front of the bar, the sticky table that keeps on wobbling despite the folded fag packet someone's carefully wedged under its foot, and those voices, their subterranean hum and echo. In the next room, some bloke rat-arsed from a funeral or a wedding's trying to sing, and did those feet? This place was old when Chaucer began writing. It's where someone, crusaders was it, or pilgrims, I can never remember, set out on their travels. Not us, though. Make yourself at home. I'll buy another. Surely we're at the exact centre of England. Looking at English Earth in a different way. This is a poem about the day when my brother and I went to scatter our father's ashes on the farm where he had spent time as a child. Scattering the ashes. At last, the rain cleared and we found a barley field where the crop was knee-high, and in our town shoes paced the lumpy furrows along the edge until our trousers were soaked. My brother held it out, open, and I pushed my hand in. It was like dark corn or oatmeal, or both, the fine dust surprisingly heavy as it sighed through the green blades and hit the earth. And like the sower in that nursery picture, to bed with the lamb and up with the laverock, we strode on, flinging it broadcast, left and right, out over the field. And there was no doubt that things were all in their places, the tumbled clouds moving back, light in the wheel ruts and puddles of the lane as we walked to the car. And yes, there were larks scribbling their songs on the sky as the air warmed up. We noticed small steps by a pool in the stream where a boy might have played, and people fetched water once, and wild watercress that streamed like green hair inside the ribbed gloss of the current. And then I was swinging the wheel as we found our way round the lane corners in a maze of tall hedges patched with wild roses, under steep slopes of larch and sycamore, glimpsing the red sandstone of castles hidden high in the woods, and the grit under our nails was the midpoint of a spectrum that ran from the pattern in our cells to the memories of two children, and it was all right. I'm going to finish with a poem called Dreaming About Oxford. Like many people who did a degree at Oxford, I still dream about being there from time to time. And I realised that this has actually got a reference to Sir Maurice Bowyer, who was the warden when I was there, here at Wadham. So maybe it's time to wake up, but as a last poem, here is Dreaming About Oxford. It's a city I must put on like a suit of clothes, insinuating myself up a college staircase like an arm snugging into the sleeve of a cashmere sweater. And though my room isn't here, it will be soon as dinner's over. Already a throng in gowns and dinner jackets is pressing around me. We're going to chapel or lunch. And look, there's Bowyer, bull-headed and stubby in his grey suit, like a sea lion barking encouragement. Ah, Lindop! But I'm out of earshot already and deep in Blackwell's. Or is it the Bodleian? Anyhow, here's an alcove crammed with books, and the alcove is up on a gallery that's lined with books, overlooking a book-filled room with passages opening out of it, walled with books. I begin to leaf through the books. Inside them are gardens, and in the gardens are buildings, and in the buildings are gardens again, with more buildings inside them. There's no hurry. I can get back to college later. I've passed the test and know I can stay here forever, or at any rate for the moment. I keep going in through doors with stone mullions and doors with linen fold panelling and sluggish unwieldy oaks with lumpy iron nail heads and panelled deal with white china knobs and gardens in trompe-l'oeil perspective painted on seasoned elm board, and the doors are becoming so many and so close together I can't tell if I'm opening doors or turning pages. But things are growing more spacious. The weight on my hands is only the weight of the sheets, and to open my eyes admits the morning and the fact that I've woken, for good or ill, though I'm far from certain which. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed to Hilary and Grevel for two beautiful readings. That was lovely. We can open to questions. So if anybody would like to ask any or all of the poets anything, please type your question in the chat and I will read it out. So I'll watch the chat and see what happens. In the meantime, perhaps I could start. This was something that I was particularly noticing, I think, listening to the last two readings, but it could be a question for all of the poets, in fact. I was noticing, I think, in Abney Park, Hilary, and in Vespers, and then Grevel, perhaps particularly in the Malden Hawk and in Scattering the Ashes, how you both beautifully used some very rhythmic repetitions. And I was wondering whether either of you, or indeed any of the poets, might like to speak a bit about how form works for you, whether form is where you start from or whether form is something that evolves in the process of writing.
Do you want to, shall I kick off? Is that acceptable? Yes, I think form, I hesitate to say form is all, and yet no, I don't think I want to apologise for saying form is all. Of course, by that I don't mean necessarily, formal rhyming, although I do use that as well. But it's form that makes the language poetry as opposed to prose. Prose has a different kind of form, but it is not rigorous in the way that a poet is using language. And so form is really it's at the heart of everything for me. Although it's, of course, it's not conscious when you're necessarily at all when you're doing it, unless you set out to do something specific. I'm sure that's a common experience. Don't know what the others think. But
I would disagree with you, Hilary. I think that prose can be as demanding, if not more demanding, than verse in some cases. I think what's exciting when you're writing a poem is when you discover the dynamic that the poem has and learn from it. I would never set out to write a poem with a theme or with a set of images. You start writing and you listen to the poem. And then there's something like a critic I read recently used the expression predictive prosody, a predictive prosody which is inherent in the poem.
Yeah.
And I'm glad you still use rhyme. I mean, rhyme is one of those predictive elements in prosody which you can then play variations on. It was Christopher Middleton who said that for every surprise there has to be an expectation, which is then surprised. You know, you have to. So it's a creation of a pattern which you can then modulate, or which modulates itself.
And I should say the language, and then I'll shut up, that the language also, I begin perhaps with a thought, an image, but then the language starts to take you to places that you didn't predict. It's not something that you can force into a straitjacket. I certainly wouldn't want people to think that, no.
My experience is that part of the poem will come. There will be a fragment, and the fragment usually seems to imply a form, or it's surrounded by a feeling of what the form's going to be. And if that kind of given piece of the poem doesn't come, then it's almost impossible to write. But once you've got that given piece, it's almost like an equation which you then proceed to work out. And the form is always implied in that starting point.
I warm very much to what Michael said about listening in that respect, because that's certainly my experience of starting. Something presents, and then you have to listen very hard to find out what it's the seed of, what are the wheels that are starting to turn.
Mm-hmm.
And there can be, as I guess we'd all agree, there can be false starts here. And I've found myself halfway through a planned poem, thinking, actually, that's not where it goes. That's not how it sounds. And having to break it down again, listen harder, and see, for example, see or hear, the lines have to be shorter, or the stanza has to be longer, or whatever. And that's part of the listening process.
Absolutely.
Oh, a question has just popped up in the chat. And it is, when would you decide to use rhyme in a poem? Which may follow on from some of what you've been saying about listening and following.
It's a curiously difficult question.
Well, not if you're writing a sonnet. You have to rhyme in a sonnet or a ballad. Don't you think that, as Hilary was saying, you're surprised by certain things? And I think if you find a rhyme happening, you then look for the next one.
Yeah. I find that I tend to turn to rhyme when I want an effective contrast in a poem, in a longer poem. Sometimes inserting a passage that is very strict, very economical and formally tight with rhyme, as a way of just drawing things together or marking a pause. I've occasionally written much longer things using rhyme, where I felt it's a tool for working something out. But normally I'd use it for contrast of tone, contrast of register within a poem, perhaps.
There are also degrees of rhyme, aren't there? Because you can have everything from full rhyme, which is very obvious, down to just a pattern of consonants or something which is barely noticeable at all. So one of the great things about the modernist revolution is that it made possible a huge spectrum of different kinds of rhyme, of greater or lesser subtlety. So sometimes these can happen without one's even noticing, and at the end you realise that you've actually got these sound connections all through.
that's a very interesting point that you make, Grevel. That one often, when you read back over something, the word that automatically suggested itself is to do with the sound resonating with something else in the poem. There's the only definition that I've ever found helpful of poetry is actually by Paul Valéry, where he talks about, I won't give it to you in French, but in the English translation is this long hesitation between sound and sense. And I think that's just so good, because that's what it feels like. Yeah.
Yeah, that's lovely. Perhaps still related to this, the construction of a poem, a question has come up saying, how do you know when a poem is finished?
I've always rather liked the comment, I think, is it Auden? I think a poem is never finished, only abandoned. You get so far, and you know that that's about as best you can do it. And then sometimes, maddeningly, you revisit it a year or two later and think, well, actually, I shouldn't have abandoned it, or it's not finished, but there's not a lot I can do about it now. And I don't know how to finish it. And I've sometimes also talked about trying to write sequences of poems. In my first published collection, there was a sequence of sonnets, in fact, quite strict sonnets with rhyme and all the rest of it. And I remember the process of writing those. 6 of them came fairly rapidly. And it took me something like 10 more years to write it, because I couldn't quite see where it was going, where it was going.
Yeah.
But I knew it wasn't finished. So perhaps it's more knowing when something isn't finished than knowing when it is. You know roughly when you've done as much as you can at that moment, and you just have to set it aside. But it's another hard question.
It could be that a poem is finished when you can't take anything more out of it. You've boiled it down so far that, if you take one word out of it, it all collapses. It's I think syllabics are a wonderful way of finding out if a poem is finished.
On a rather different kind of tack, there's a question about how lockdown has impacted your poetic practice, if it has.
Made it curiously difficult to write for quite some time, despite apparently having a lot of time available. It became much harder. I'm not sure why.
Whether we always, in some sense, write in a lockdown of our own making, but when a lockdown is bowled at us, it feels different. I don't know.
Exactly so. Exactly so.
May I make a slight factual adjustment to Grevel's poem? Grevel's introduction to his Guadalupe poem. It isn't a cathedral, it's a basilica. I'm sorry to correct.
Oh, I do apologize.
Grevel never makes mistakes, so it's not often I get to wrong foot him. I've just wrong footed you, Grevel. You have to buy a lunch next time.
Okay, mea culpa.
I think we've probably got time for just one more question. So I'll take the one that says how much the listener has enjoyed how many of these poems engaged with artwork. And she asks, what are some ways that poetry can help us to understand visual art and vice versa?
Great silence. Shall I say something? I think it varies. There is quite a lot. It's a little bit fashionable at the moment to write what are called ekphrastic poems.
Yeah.
If I hear that word ekphrastic once more, I shall
yeah.
my poker. It doesn't mean that writing poems about paintings, isn't sometimes a good thing. But I do think sometimes people confuse two media which are very, very different in many ways. And yes, poetry moves in images often artistically, certainly visually, I think visually very powerfully. But I do think one needs to not get carried away by thinking that the two media can automatically be put together in some meaningful way.
The Victorian painters, of course, might have disagreed with you. There's so many poems that grow out, paintings that grow out of Scott and other great poets of Rossetti and all the period. And I think Ekphrasis is just going in the other direction. What is it when a painter takes his inspiration from? Is that poesis? No, but I too am impatient with ekphrastic poetry, because I think the two arts are doing things that are quite different. And one is arrest, and one is dynamism in painting is a very different kind of experience from the unbuttonedness of Christopher Smart or Blake or something like that.
Yeah, I take the point, but as somebody who's written quite a lot of ekphrastic poems and is now feeling very embarrassed about it.
Well, you've been very good, Rowan.
I think I'd want to say there's something going on, which is any serious art form disrupts and enlarges the perception that you bring. Now, if a particular visual work of art disrupts and extends your field of perception, then one of the things you might want to do is to try and map in your words some of that enlargement, some of that disruption. So it's not trying to render another medium.
No.
It's a kind of triangulation. It's bouncing off how that particular work has started another train of thought off. So not just trying to capture.
Dialogue, maybe.
Maybe.
Wonderful. Well, we're just at the end of our hour and a half. I'd like to say thank you very much indeed to all four readers for some really, really wonderful readings. They were fantastic. I wonder if we would break the internet if we risked unmuting and actually clapping. Should we try it?